Hi, everyone. Welcome to the last session of Rabbi Silber's series on the Torah and Haftarah readings for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. It's our last session. We're going to be talking about the Haftarah of Rosh Hashanah. And of course, as always, you can put questions in the chat, which I can pass on for you, or you can raise your hand to speak. I'll be promoting you to panelists, which does not mean that you have to speak, just that you'll be able to turn on your cameras. We'd love to see your faces, and you can raise your hand to ask questions. Enjoy.
Okay, can we begin, Chaya? Okay, thank you. All right. So let's begin with Rosh Hashanah. As we've pointed out, the Torah readings for Rosh Hashanah say nothing about Rosh Hashanah. Let's begin with that. And because in point of fact, the Torah itself says virtually nothing about Rosh Hashanah. So Rosh Hashanah is one line in the book of Vayikra, another line or two in the book of Bamidbar. And that's it. It's never actually referenced again. So Rosh Hashanah is a day that is open to, I say, to rabbinic interpretation, and it's a day that is fashioned by the rabbinic mind and by the rabbinic tradition. Neither Torah reading, neither the first day of Rosh Hashanah nor the second day, two adjoining chapters in the book of Bereshit, chapters 21 and 22, mention, of course, anything about Rosh Hashanah. So that we discussed already, the Torah readings of Rosh Hashanah. And what I'd like to do is to talk a bit about the Haftarot. We'll start with Rosh Hashanah and we see how far we get. So first, there's a point in general about the Haftarot. The Haftarot, all of them without exception, are taken from the prophetic writings, all of them. There are no Haftarot from what's called the Ketuvim. Ketuvim being things like Book of Nehemiah, Daniel, Ezra. Those books, there are no Haftarot, the Megillot as well. All the Haftarot are from the prophetic writings. What's interesting, by the way, just in passing, that I had the opportunity to listen to, I've listened to a few of the classes that we're offering in Elul. And I was listening to Dr. Gaffney's class, and he asked the question about the davening on Rosh Hashanah. And his question was, why is it that in the prayer of Rosh Hashanah, which consists essentially of biblical verses, that the order of the verses in the Musaf, Malchiot, Zichronot, Shofrot, the first three verses are from the Torah, the next three verses are from the Psalms, and the next three verses are from the prophetic writings. He asked the question, isn't that a strange order? Because, I mean, he's not the first to ask the question, but we always talk about Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, but in the davening of Rosh Hashanah, it's Torah, Ketuvim, Nevi'im. So he offered a couple of, not his own suggestions, a couple of suggestions, but I was thinking that actually a very simple answer is this, that the prophetic writings often, and this is true of many of the Haftarot, not all, but many, the Haftarot were chosen to be counterpoints to the Torah reading. And essentially, one of the main themes in the Haftarot in general are words of hope, words of consolation. Right now, we're in the midst of almost finishing the 7 Haftarot of consolation from Yeshayahu, Yeshiva Dinechemta. But in general, the Haftarot serve as a counterpoint to the Torah reading and leave us with hope. Talk about a better future. And that's certainly true of the davening of Rosh Hashanah. The three verses, and we'll come to one of them later, I hope, that appear towards the end of the Malchiot, that is verses number 7, 8, 9. There are a total of 10. The 10th one, though, is separate from the Torah. It's in the request section. But of the 9 verses, the last 3 are from the prophets because they're words of hope, words of consolation. And by the way, it's also true of something else where we recite verses. Apart from Rosh Hashanah, one place where we find a lot of verses being cited is a ritual that is maybe the core Jewish ritual that we have, which is the Seder. At the Seder, the Haggadah presents us with a bunch of drashot. And the strange thing about the drashot at the Seder is that the verse is explicated by virtue of citing another biblical verse. And what's interesting, there are 4 verses. What's interesting is the only 2 verses taken from the prophetic writings. The first of which is the last drasha on the first verse. And the last one is the last drasha of the 4th verse. That's the Dam Va'esh V'Timrot Ashan, right? That Dam Va'esh V'Timrot Ashan is from the prophet Yoel. And it speaks of a better future, a kind of a messianic time. And that's from the prophets. The rest of the verses are all from the Torah, and there's one verse from the Ketuvim. But the prophetic verse that's cited is the last verse. So it strikes me that's true of the Rosh Hashanah davening, that we always cite the prophetic writings last because the prophetic writings speak of a much better future, a messianic time, a better future, gives us a lot of hope. And especially in the middle section of Rosh Hashanah, which is Zichronot, which is about judgment, but the end of it speaks about covenantal connection to God and speaks of God remembering us fondly. And we'll come back to that hopefully later, because that last verse of Zichronot, one might say, and it's somewhat subjective, the key verse of the Zichronot section is taken, of course, from the prophetic writings. It's the last verse in the Zichronot, and it's coming from the Haftarah of Rosh Hashanah. Anyway, that's just a word in general about the prophetic writings, and in general, they are words of consolation. Now, the Rosh Hashanah Haftarot are very interesting because neither the Torah readings nor the Haftarot on the face of it, they certainly don't mention Rosh Hashanah. And the question now is, what is the connection? If it was chosen by that tradition, obviously, they wanted us to make the connection between Rosh Hashanah and the particular Haftarah. So the Haftarah for the first day of Rosh Hashanah is the story of the birth of Shmuel, the story of Chana. It's parallel to the Parsha. The Parsha is Torah reading for the first day is Vashem Palkadet Sarah. God remembers Sarah, and Sarah as a child. Sarah as Yitzchak in her old age. And the Haftarah also speaks about a situation where a man is married to 2 women, one of whom has children, one who does not. Similar to Abraham, he marries Hagar, she has a child, Sarah does not. And of course, the story is familiar to us, I'm sure, that the Chana prays to God, and God answers Chana's prayer. And in thinking about the Haftarah, which is chapter 1 of Shmuel and the first 10 verses of chapter 2, let's first begin by taking note of the fact that in the Haftarah, there are 2 kinds of prayers. There's the one prayer in chapter 1 of Shmuel, and that is 1 verse long, that Chana prays to God, and very important verse, and that is verse number 11. Chana is crying, and Vatidor Neder Vatomar in chapter 1 verse 11, she took a vow, and she said, Hashem Tzvaot, Lord of hosts, Imraot Tireh B'Aniyah Motecha, if you look at the Aniyah Motecha, the affliction, I would say, the affliction of your servant.
Anguish, maybe.
What?
Anguish, maybe.
Anguish, affliction, right? Same along those lines, right? Anguish or affliction, they're both good. Uzachartani, and remember me. Do not forget me. And give your maidservant Zerah Anoshim a child. I will hand him over to God all the days of his life. And literally a razor will not go over his hair, he won't cut his hair. That is the sum total of Chana's prayer in chapter 1. In chapter 2, there's a 10-verse prayer, which I presume can be seen as a prayer of gratitude. I'll get back to that later. And that's the story of Chana. And Eli, who's watching her, thinks that she's drunk because her lips are moving, but he can't hear anything. He thinks she's drunk, and he says to her, listen, leave this holy place until you sober up. Sober up, you can come back, but leave here, it's inappropriate. And she says to him, I'm not drunk. I'm just embittered. I pour out my heart before God. One might say, not what I imbibe, not what I take in, but rather I'm pouring out. And Ewi understands that. He says, but God should grant your request. So the question is, for our purposes, not to explore the whole story of Chana in the first chapter of the book of Shmuel, but our task is to see what connections we can find between the story of Chana's prayer and the birth of Shmuel, prayers and the birth of Shmuel, and the day of Rosh Hashanah as it is understood, or one might even say constructed, by the rabbinic tradition. So let me make a few comments about this prayer of Chana and potentially its connection to Rosh Hashanah. Let me begin by simply pointing out that the prayer of Chana is understood by our tradition to be the central prayer. That is to say, there are many prayers, but the prayer of Chana becomes the model for Jewish prayer. Jewish prayer, in the narrow construction of Jewish prayer, is what we call the Amidah, or the silent prayer, Tefillah B'Lachash, and Chana is praying silently, quietly, and we can't hear a word. So this becomes, for our tradition, the primary prayer, which is very striking. And since it's the primary prayer, I think it behooves us to try to understand some of the elements of this prayer. So the Tefillah B'Lachash. So let's begin by positing that the day of Rosh Hashanah, as understood by our tradition, the Torah says little. The Torah says Yom Trua Yelachem. It's a day of Trua, a day of crying out. Understood rabbinically, a day of shofar. Trua is a noise or cry. And the rabbinic understanding of Yom Trua is that this cry is a kind of prayer. So Rosh Hashanah is a day of prayer. On our calendar, there are two main days of prayer. There's Rosh Hashanah and there's Yom Kippur. Those are our two great days of prayer. And the prayer of Rosh Hashanah, at its core, is represented by the shofar. So it's a prayer which has actually no words. It's a prayer with no words. And this prayer with no words, in terms of Rosh Hashanah and how it plays out in our prayers, the shofar represents two different kinds of prayers. On one hand, the shofar is a trumpet, whatever instrument it is. It's a Rosh Hashanah is a coronation ceremony. God is proclaimed king, and the coronation of God, coronation of a king or whatever. There's certain kinds of musical instruments that are played at a coronation, typically. And the Ashkenazim, in any event, before we blow the shofar the first time, we recite Psalm number 47, and that psalm speaks of the entire world singing. Zamru Elohim Zameru, Zamru Elohim, Zamru Maskil, crying, singing. So it's one aspect of the shofar, is that it is a musical instrument. We know that from the Psalms as well. Hallelu b'teika shofar. Praise God with the sound of the shofar, teika shofar. So on one hand, what the shofar represents, it reflects the fact that the day of Rosh Hashanah is a day of asserting that God is king. And this plays out in the davening of Rosh Hashanah in many different ways, including in Shacharit, on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the Chazan begins with the word Hamelech. There's a little introductory chant, and then Hamelech. That's how we start Rosh Hashanah, and all the blessings of Rosh Hashanah speak of God's kingship. So one element of the shofar, it's an instrument, it's the music that accompanies the coronation ceremony. That's one element of the shofar. But then the shofar has another side to it, because it's Yom Trua Yelachem, and Trua is understood by the rabbinic tradition to be the broken sound. Exactly what kind of broken sound there the Talmud discusses that and has three options. Maybe it's the staccato, what we call a trua, bop, 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 bop. Or maybe it's more of a sigh, a shvarim, or maybe it's a shvarim followed by a trua. But whichever way you understand it, it's a kind of cry. In fact, the Targum on Yom Trua says Yom Yavava, a day of crying. So shofar then represents two different things on Rosh Hashanah. It represents the crowning of God as king, coronation ceremony. And then additionally, at the very same time, and maybe even primarily, it's understood as a day of crying. So we're crying out to God. We're pleading with God. There are no words. So it's a plea without words. One might say that the tekiah, the plain sound, is more in the mode of coronation, crowning of God. And the trua, the broken sound, is more, makes more sense if it reflects the cry, the plea. So those are the two sounds of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. And this is the two aspects of the day of Rosh Hashanah itself. It's a day of proclaiming God as king. That's a holiday. That's a happy day. But then there's the other side of it. It's a day of crying out to God. It's a day of pleading with God, even though we don't have the words yet. But we do have the plea. So that's the shofar. And now, looking at the Haftarah, when we read the story of Hannah, we see that Hannah has two kinds of prayers. In the first chapter, she pleads with God to have a child. And in the second chapter, after Shmuel is born, then we have this 10-verse prayer in chapter 2, after the birth of Samuel, which would appear on its surface in any event, not to be a petition to God necessarily, but more a statement about God. So we'll get back to that in a minute. So let me say on the first level, on the first point, is that perhaps, and I'll make several suggestions over here, and then I'll hear what you have to say. One suggestion is that since Rosh Hashanah is defined as a day of prayer, so we turn to, first, what is the most central prayer in the Jewish tradition? It's the prayer upon which all prayers are based, which is Chana. But Chana, in effect, is two prayers. She has one prayer in chapter 1, a petition. She's crying. She's very bitter, as she says about herself. I'm an embittered person. And then in chapter 2, after the child is born, is a 10-verse, I would say, statement about God that we'll come back to. That's the first point. That's one possible connection between Rosh Hashanah and the Haftarah. Okay. Now, there's something else here about the prayers of Chana. And let me jump for a moment to the second prayer of Chana, which is the second chapter. When I was a kid, we had to memorize that. I don't know if you had to memorize it. We had to memorize Tfilat Chana. So it's interesting, first of all, that the prayer of Chana in the second chapter, after Samuel was born, one expects a prayer of gratitude for the child being born. But when you actually read those 10 verses, there's virtually very little to suggest that it's related to Shmuel being born. There's one half line there about the barren woman having children. Outside of that, none of these verses appear to be remotely connected to the birth of this child, to God answering her prayer. But it is curious that the first verse of chapter 2, it begins with Vatitpalel Chana Vatomar. The book of Shmuel calls this a tefillah. Tefillah is often used when we are petitioning to God. We're making a request of God. So it sounds like this prayer of thanksgiving, one could say, is not simply a prayer of thanksgiving, but there's some kind of petition here as well. So let me just reflect for a moment about what the petition is in chapter 2. Now we have to remember that this 10-verse prayer of Chana is the beginning of the book of Shmuel. And even though it appears to have little relationship to Chana having a child, many years ago I was speaking someplace or other, and someone said to me, Listen, everybody knows that this prayer could not possibly have been written for a woman who has a child. It was obviously written for some other occasion. To which I said to this fellow, I said, okay, I'm willing to accept that, except for one thing. But the author of this book put it in chapter 2. So it actually heightens the question. Since it bears a little relationship to Hannah having a child, then why in fact is it here? That's the question. Wherever it's imported from, irrelevant to me. It's an interesting question. But in point of fact, it's the beginning of the book of Shmuel. And I believe that a simple answer here, simple understanding of Hannah's prayer is actually comes down to the last verse. Because the 10 verses over here are a description, Hannah's description of the way Hannah thinks God should run the world. If you read the description of how the world should run, in these 10 verses, it's God who breaks the bow of the strong ones, and the weaker ones can operate valiantly. Those that are hungry have food, and those that have food do not. Those who had many children become bereft, and those that had no children give birth. God brings life and takes life. God makes rich and God makes poor. God, says Hannah, will judge the haughty and the wicked. They will dwell in darkness. But Raglei Chasidav Yishmar. But the feet of the righteous ones, the ones who trust in God, God's still loyal to God, God will protect them. Person should not succeed by dint of force and violence. Hashem Yadin Afseyaretz, God will judge the world. Yitain Oz Lumalko, the last verse, and give strength to God's king. V'yarem Keren Mishicho, and exalt the horn of God's anointed. So the last verse actually speaks of God who will give strength to God's king and raise up the one that God has anointed. So the prayer in the last verse of Hannah's prayer is a prayer for a king, which is why it's at the beginning of the book of Shmuel, which is the book of kingship. It's all about kingship. That's what the book's about. And the claim that Hannah makes, what Hannah believes to be true, one can certainly question this. The one who questioned this actually was her son Samuel. He doesn't believe it. But his mother believes, that's how the book of Shmuel begins, that this idea of the world in which the righteous people are vindicated and the wicked are judged unfavorably, and people that operate with violence will not succeed. And those who are loyal and pious, they'll get their due reward. That's what Hannah says, the way I know God wants to run the world. And what Hannah's prayer is, Hannah believes that a human king can reflect God's values. That's what Hannah believes. God gives strength to a king who will put your values into play. Remember that the story of Hannah, she walked into Shiloh, which is the seat of power in the beginning of the book of Shmuel, run by 2 corrupt priests. It's a place which is utterly corrupt. It's a place which God plans to and does, in fact, destroy 2 chapters later. So what Hannah is talking about, and here we come to Rosh Hashanah. Because as we all know, what Rosh Hashanah is about primarily is God's kingship. God is the king. HaMelech HaKadosh, we say on Rosh Hashanah. Melech HaKol Haaretz. God is king of the world because God created the world, not just the king of the Jews. God is king of the world. The prayer in the third blessing, V'chein tein pachtecha Hashem Elokeinu hakol ma'asecha, emotcha makom asher barata, oleinu shabeach v'adon hakol. This messianic dream that the world will be united, come to understand what God demands of us, and be able to carry it out. That's what Rosh Hashanah is about. It's about God's kingship. But the Haftarah has an additional dimension, which is it's all fine and good to speak of God's kingship. But what about us? What about us humans? What's our role in all this? And what Chana claims is that the role of the human beings is to reflect God's kingship. And the role of the leader, king, is to lead in such a way that the king puts into place God's values. That is what's at the heart of the book of Shmuel, because her son Samuel believes that's not possible. Her son Samuel believes that no king will ever do this, because when you give, for two reasons. First of all, what it takes to become king, all the machinations and the politics that it takes to become the king. And once you do become the king, you are enticed by the power of kingship and you abuse the power. So that's what Samuel claims. And he's opposed to kingship because it can't possibly work. His mother thought it could possibly work. And when you study the book of Shmuel, what you're trying to figure out is, what is God's opinion? That's what the book of Shmuel is about. What does God think of all this? Does God go along with it? You made your choice, bad choice. Or does God actually believe in the book of Shmuel and the Bible in general? Is God's position that human kingship, it may be fraught with danger, but it's not impossible. So what the Haftarah does then is, it takes the way it's set up for us by our tradition, on this day of God's kingship, in the Haftarah, we are reading about human kingship, one might say human responsibility, because that's what Chana is claiming. Chana says, I believe that we can put into place a political structure in which the head of the political structure, in the Bible it's the king, can reflect God's true will. That's the claim that she makes. The book of Shmuel is dedicated to this question. Okay, so that's basically another reason, I think, that, and a good one, that our tradition has chosen the story of Chana as the Haftarah. Okay, that's the second point. Now there's something else here about the story of Chana. Maybe after this point, I'll stop and take comments and questions, then add a couple of other things about Chana. The story of Chana, actually, Chana has a request. Her husband is married to two women. One has children, she does not. And she wants a child. And she is praying to God for a child. And she's very, very unhappy because her rival taunts her. Her husband has told her that give up on the idea. It's not going to happen, he says. You have me. I'm better than 10 children, he says. He means well, no doubt. A loving husband, but that's not what Chana wants to hear. And so Chana is praying for a child. Her request is a very personal request that we can all understand it. Everybody has things in their lives that we feel are missing. If we only had them, life would be better off. It is true that very often the very thing we pray for to make our lives better makes our lives very miserable. That is true. But some things, sometimes we really understand what we need. We pray for it, and hopefully we can be answered favorably. But the point here about Chana's prayer, I think this is a very important point in general. I think someone raised it in one of my classes recently, and that is that Chana, what is Chana really praying for? It's a core question when you study the book of Shmuel, because it's a very strange prayer. She calls herself your Amotecha, if you listen to your maidservant and you respond to your maidservant and you remember me, don't forget me. Then, if you give me a child, I will dedicate the child to God all the days of his life. So actually what Chana does is, after she fully nurses him, she gives him over. She hands him over to Shiloh, hands him over to the high priest to serve God under the mentorship of Eli, the high priest. So it's a rather peculiar prayer. If you give me a child, I will give the child back to you. So what is that actually about? And it strikes me what it's about is this, that in the story of Chana, and maybe this is one of the reasons that our tradition has chosen Chana's story as the core prayer. What you have over here is, on one hand, she prays for herself. She wants a child. But actually, that's not the primary reason I think she wants a child. She wants a child because she believes that if you give me this child, and I will teach the child and educate the child and train this child, that this child will be able to effect in society a change for the good. Not that her child will become the king. She doesn't expect her child to become the king. It's clear that her child will not be the king, because what she says is, if you give me the child, I will dedicate the child to God, and no razor shall cut his hair. So that reminds us of the Nazir. The Nazir and the king are actually completely opposites, diametrically opposed to each other. The king is the ultimate insider. The Nazir is the ultimate outsider. But the point of the Nazir, like the prophet, is another outsider. But in point of fact, her child will be instrumental in setting up a better political system. Samuel is the anointer of both kings. He's the anoints Saul and he anoints David. He happens to be opposed to kingship, which is part of makes the book particularly interesting. But my point is a different point, which is that there are personal prayers and there are prayers for the community. Hannah walks into Shiloh and she understands something is very wrong here. And she's praying to God to allow her to be a vehicle to change her world. She can't do it herself. This woman is not going to change it herself, but she can train the person who's going to do it. If you give me this child, then this child will be able to change the world. And in fact, those who study the book of Shmuel, of course, know that the character of Shmuel in the book of Shmuel is based upon Moshe. What she's really asking for is, we need another Moses. We need a Moses to take us out of Egypt, because we're in a spiritual Egypt, not a geographic Egypt. Eli's in the temple. There's a temple, but the temple has become corrupted. God is not speaking, which is typical of Egypt, exile. God doesn't talk. We have to change the world. So my point is that over here, interestingly, in terms of prayer, we have the confluence of two things. We have the personal prayer and we have the communal prayer. And it's interesting to think about that. Someone is leading the prayer service, or even anybody who prays. We're thinking about our own situation, completely legitimate. But we also think of the larger communities in which we live, the local community, the Jewish people, the world, the whole range of communities. And we are thinking about that as well. Situation in the world, there's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of problems, and we're thinking about ourselves as well. The point of Hannah's prayer is that the two actually come together. She's thinking about her own situation. She wants God to respond to her, but it's not just about her. If it were just about her, she wouldn't dedicate the child to God. And this becomes the vehicle for change in the book of Shmuel. So that's another reason I think that perhaps the story of Hannah was chosen. The assumption I make about Rosh Hashanah, my understanding is that Rosh Hashanah, from the very beginning, is the great day of prayer, together with Yom Kippur. It's the great day of prayer. There are more prayers, complicated prayers, different dimensions to prayer, but it is certainly one of, if not, the primary day of prayer. So that's another aspect to this, which is in thinking of Rosh Hashanah and the day of judgment, we think of the personal judgment. We also think about the world. And in fact, in the middle section of the davening on Rosh Hashanah, that we call Zichronot, that God is Zocher, God is remembering, God is judging. So it talks about God who judges individuals. Every individual was judged. And then, if you recall the beginning of the Zichronot, V'al HaMedinot Bo Ye'omer, and concerning the nations, it is said, Ezel HaCherev, V'ezel HaSholom, Ezel HaRav, Ezel HaSova, Ubriot Bo Yipokedu. So nations are judged, individuals are judged. So that there's a double judgment taking place. And I think the Haftarah invites all of us engaged in prayer to think about our own personal situation, but to try to connect that in some way, so we have to be oblivious to the fact that we live in a big world with a lot of problems. So the dual nature of prayer, the personal prayer and the communal prayer, they come together perfectly in Hannah's prayer. Those are 3 points. I have a couple of other things to say, but I'll stop at this point. And if anybody has comments or questions about the story of Chana and the choice of this Haftarah for Rosh Hashanah, I'm happy to hear. Either in the chat, or speak up, unmute. Chai, is there anybody who you have wants to say something?
There are no written questions in the chat, but we have a raised hand.
Go ahead. Yes.
Shalom. Thank you so much. Can you elaborate on why you feel Rosh Hashanah is the great day of prayer in opposition perhaps to Yom Kippur?
No, not in opposition to Yom Kippur. I would put those 2 days on the same plane.
Oh.
They're different. Yom Kippur is a day about the human being, our potential, our transformation, and Rosh Hashanah is more a focus on God. Chana's prayer is about the way the world should be. It's about God's kingship, God, the way God wants the world to run, and the human responsibility to see that God's will is carried out. That I think is Rosh Hashanah. But I certainly, just from an experiential standpoint, I think we all, I mean, the 2 great prayer days, you stand in prayer on Yom Kippur pretty much all day, depending where you go, and Rosh Hashanah, just it takes longer, it's just a very intense day of prayer, there's no question. So my point is that I think it's really set up that way. You see on Rosh Hashanah, there are more blessings, and it comes down to the shofar as understood, the way the rabbis understood the shofar, that it's not simply an announcement that today is Rosh Chodesh of the 7th month, which it certainly is in the Chumash, but that carries with it all kinds of other pieces. So I would say that from an experiential standpoint, I think that's clear. And I think even looking at the text, Yom Kippur is certainly that way. It's 5 different services, all very different from each other. And really the idea of Yom Kippur is a day in which we, typically I think if we think about our own lives and think about how things are going or not going well, we try to correct it. We should try to correct it, but we don't actually sit down, most of us probably don't sit down every day and think, let me see how I messed up today or what's going wrong. In Yom Kippur, we're actually invited to think in those terms, to actually proactively think about what is wrong. Not just if something happens to hit me that I'm making a mistake or whatever, but to really go into the depth of our own being. And I would also add that in the confession of Yom Kippur, which is very striking, and there are many confessions, but the long confession of Yom Kippur, the Al-Chet, at the end of it, we talk about the various sins we have committed, those that are capital offenses, those that are, flagellation, those that are Isser Aseh, those that are Lavi, all different types. And then we say those that are known to us and those that are not known to us. As it is written, Haznistarot Hashem Elokeinu, this week's Torah reading. The hidden things are to God. In other words, the idea that you plumb your own depths, even the things that require forgiveness for things we don't know that we did, which means the davening invites us to think in these terms, to think about what in fact have I done wrong? We think about that. Even though it's something I don't know, I'm responsible for things I don't know I did wrong, which is pretty frightening thought. So I think it's pretty clear that Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are the 2 great days of prayer in it, but they're very different from each other. Clearly, they're radically different days. Okay, thank you for that question and clarification. Let me just say one other thing about Chana's prayer, which I think is relevant to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And there's something about this prayer. The prayer is 1 verse long, and it begins with the words "Vatidar Neder." She took a vow. The form of Chana's prayer is a vow. I tell you something. I quoted this many times, many years ago at Drisha. So I invited, all kinds of people came to Drisha and speak. So I invited a rabbi named Roi Madeline, rabbi of BJ in New York City. And he has very interesting, he thinks a lot about prayer. His synagogue, say not an Orthodox synagogue, his synagogue has a lot of music. And the topic was music, actually. So at the end, after he spoke, I asked the question because I wanted to hear how he would formulate a response. And I said, I know in your synagogue you have all kinds of music going on. What is the place of music in your service? Is it the central thing? By the way, having said that, you should know that Drisha just came out with podcasts with instrumentals on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which is, I think, on YouTube, Drisha, Facebook, Spotify. I would urge you to listen to it. I think it's very interesting. So Rolly said, no, I love music. It enhances the service, there's no question. But at the end of the day, davening is about commitment. We commit with words, not with music. I like that formulation. And that's what you have over here. Chana's asking something of God, and she understands that if you're requesting something, then it's incumbent to also commit to something. There's no free ride. Covenants are two-sided. If you do this for me, I will do that for you, which is the way the Bible defines a vow. A vow in the Bible is always conditional. If you do this for me, I will do that. If you grant me the child, I will dedicate the child to God's service. That's the neder. And that's what I think lies at the core of prayer. And it is interesting in this respect that we begin Yom Kippur service, even before Yom Kippur. We begin Yom Kippur with Kol Nidre. And what Kol Nidre is a ceremonial, and the court ceremonial, and those vows that we thought we could take. We made commitments we thought we could keep, and it turns out we were not capable of keeping those commitments. Something came up, we hadn't foreseen it, etc. And the way I thought about Kol Nidre is it's not actually intended, in my view, others may disagree with this, but I don't think it's intended to warn us about taking vows or about making commitments. My understanding is it's exactly the opposite. What we're saying, Kol Nidre, is we're starting the year. We want to recommit ourselves to living better this year. And we're going to make all kinds of resolutions and commitments. And don't be afraid to make those commitments because of the fear that you won't be able to do it. If you really can't do it, there's a way out. But what's important as we start Yom Kippur and talk about repentance, what's important is that we understand that these commitments are essential. So on the great day of prayer, which is Yom Kippur, together with Rosh Hashanah, we begin by, in a sense, making the statement that there are ways out. If we understand the human condition, people don't always foretell or foresee the future. And the rabbinic understanding, which takes into account the human condition, says, if you took a commitment that you really didn't understand the nature of, then we will absolve you from that. But don't stop to commit yourselves in all kinds of ways to making things better, which is, I guess we call that tshuva. Tshuva means I'm going to take a different path. I'm not going to do the same thing. So the choice of the story of Chana, then, it's all about prayer in a very deep sense. And what's interesting is that Chana is a prayer. There's no noise, there's no sound. Kala lo yishameya. You can't hear. She is saying words, but no one can hear the words. So it's a sort of an interesting counterpoint to the shofar. The shofar, you can hear the sound, but there are no words to the shofar. It's a very striking. On Yom Kippur, there are a million words. In Rosh Hashanah, there are no words. Because on Rosh Hashanah, we suddenly stand before the king, and the king happens to be a judge, and we suddenly have this anxiety that we feel insufficient standing before the judge. We have a kind of angst or anxiety, and we don't even know yet how to respond. Don't have the words, but we blow the shofar, which is a reflection of the deepest parts of ourselves that we ourselves have not yet necessarily understood. We can't comprehend exactly what's wrong. We have this feeling that something's not right. We're thinking about repentance. We don't know how to do it. And that's the shofar. So in the Haftarah, actually, you have the other side of it, which is there's no sound at all. At the end of the day, prayer is what's in your heart. Yes, we say words, but at the end of the day, it's the commitments that we make, even silent commitments that we make. So again, the choice of Chana's Haftarah of Chana, say the mother of all prayer, is a very appropriate one. Let me just say one more thing about Hannah's prayer. And that is that it's interesting about, I mean, the book of Shmuel is written, it's one of the truly great books ever. I mean, it's a book that I love dearly. And when Hannah prays to God, it's interesting that she has one verse. 3 times in the verse, she refers to herself as Amatecha, your servant or your slave. Remember, do not forget, she says, so there's a deep sense of real humility over here. On the other hand, what is she saying, if my interpretation is correct? What she's saying is, if you give me the opportunity, I will change the world. Now, let me put it this way. She's standing inside the temple. She's standing inside this temple, Shiloh. She looks around. She says, God, I'm standing inside your Mishkan. It is utterly and totally corrupt. And the Mishkan is the story, the end of the book of Shemot, the end of Exodus. We left Egypt. Moshe took us out of Egypt. And we build this Mishkan. I'm standing in Moses' Mishkan. And you gave all the instructions. It's utterly corrupt. It is, God, in all due respect, a failure. But you know what? If you give me the opportunity, give me a Moses, and I will train that Moses. And we'll build a Mishkan that actually makes some sense, that actually could work, which in point of fact is the last chapter of the book of Shmuel, the story of Gor and Aravna. It's the last chapter. What a chutzpah. The Gemara actually picks up on this from another perspective. Chana hiticha devarim klape mala. Chana had a lot of nerve, threw things up to heaven. And that's what prayer is actually about. It's actually about, on one hand, it's chutzpah. You're telling God what you need. You're demanding. Okay, you're demanding in a sweet way, but what do you mean? I need this, I need this, I need this, I need that. On the other hand, there's got to be a recognition, who are we to ask in the first place? As Avram said, so prayer is these 2 elements. It reminds me of a poem that the Ashkenazim say one time in the year. The Sephardim say it every Shabbos, but the Ashkenazim say it one time in the year. It's called Aderes V'Emunah. There are many nigunim. We have on the podcast 2 very good nigunim for Aderes V'Emunah. There are plenty of them. And one of the lines in Aderes V'Emunah that I like very much, it describes God's attributes. Chai Olamim, God is called. Ha'oz v'ha'anava v'chai Olamim. You know, Drisha started yeshiva in Israel. Yeshiva, women learn in this yeshiva in Israel. It's an actual yeshiva, not an upana, not a beit midrash. It's yeshiva, like yeshiva at Har Etzion. Real yeshiva. If you go to Israel, you should visit this place. And I was thinking of calling the yeshiva Oz v'Anava. I like that. Because that's what it is. On one hand, it's breaking a new path. It's something new. And you need to have a certain amount of confidence that you can actually do something. At the same time, we always need anava. We need the humility to understand how much do we really know, how much can we really do. That's Oz v'Anava. And that's what prayer is actually, that's Chana's prayer. Chana iticha dvarim klape mala. And 3 times she calls herself Amatecha. So she's well aware of her limitations. Who am I, she says. On the other hand, what I'm seeing is, I'm seeing the world the way I see it with my eyes. I'm standing in your temple, which is no good. It's run by the corrupt priests. We got to go a different path. Why don't you give me a chance to do it, and I'll do it right. That's Chana's prayer. And that's something to think about on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. The human stance when we enter into prayer, to think about what we're capable of, at the same time to recognize our severe limitations, of course. So there's more to say. I'll stop at this point with the Haftarah of Chana, but my point is that all of these elements of prayer are present in the story of Chana, both the stance of one who prays, both what prayer is about, the idea of imagining a different world. The world is like this. It doesn't have to be this way. It can be different. That's what Chana's thinking is. I imagine a different world. To be able to imagine a different world, to be able to step out of our own reality and to imagine that things could be better and different. which is not easy to do. So therefore, I think for all these reasons, our tradition has chosen the story of Hannah on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. Okay, now let me continue with. Let's get to the second day of Rosh Hashanah. Yes, please speak up. Yes, someone wants to talk there? Okay, I thought I saw someone raise their hand.
No, yes, I just had to unmute.
Go ahead.
Now, when you were talking about Nidarim, it just struck me that maybe there's a parallel to Vayidar Yaakov Neder Lemor, when Yaakov makes a neder, and he wants something from Hashem, but he's also willing to give back. He's willing to make to build a Beit Elohim and to give back Aser Asrenulach, to give God back, however you understand it.
Every biblical
10th or
neder is the
20th.
same. They're always conditional. They're always, if you give me X, I'll give back. I would say the instinct in prayer is that way. If you're asking somebody for something, you're asking God for something. Not that I deserve it, but I'm asking you to help me out. Isn't it a normal human response? If somebody does something for you, you want to repay it, you want to give back. To me, that's what it means to be a human being. How can you, right? Someone's giving you a gift. Wouldn't you want to pay it back in some way? Do something, commit to something? To me, it's obvious. I don't know, but they're all that way. That is the definition of neder in the Bible. The Talmud has a different definition of neder versus shvua. But in the Tanakh, it's certainly that way. I mean, even Yiftach's wrong-headed neder. It's the same thing. If you let me win the war, I will sacrifice the first thing that comes out of my house. Okay, it was a stupid neder, but that's what a neder is. I don't mean it's stupid. I mean it's, if you do something for me, I will, of course, I'll do something back. I want to do something back. I want to repay it. I don't want something for nothing. I understand that every time I'm given something, it involves a counter commitment, of course. To me, that's obvious. But they're all that way. And you mentioned Yaakov's neder. If we had another couple of hours, we would talk about that, because Yaakov, and I've spoken about it in the past a little bit, but that story of Yaakov is also central to Rosh Hashanah for other reasons. But time won't allow to go into that now. Let me just talk briefly about the second day of Rosh Hashanah. It is interesting to note, by the way, that whereas on Rosh Hashanah, if we had to pick out one person in the davening, the central figure in the Rosh Hashanah davening, if you ask me, it will be our patriarch Abraham. Story Abraham Avinu, who was central to the middle blessing, to Zichronot. We ask God to remember the Akedah. Remember the way Abraham was able to overcome his basic nature of being gracious and kind, to do your bidding. So too, you should overcome your basic nature, God, which is to be truthful. God's seal is truth. But God should employ mercies to overcome God's basic nature of emet. It's God's basic quality in the davening. God's seal is truth. So he's the basic person, I would say. If you had to pick out one person who's the hero of Rosh Hashanah, I would pick out Abraham. But what's interesting is when you come to the Torah and the Haftarah readings, it's not Abraham. It's the first day, it's Sarah. She's the main Torah reading. The Haftarah for the first day is Hannah. And the Haftarah for the second day is our patriarch Rachel. Rachel Mavaka al Bonera is the reading of the Haftarah for day number 2. So let me just say something about our mother Rachel in the Haftarah from Yirmiyahu. The book of Yirmiyahu doesn't have that many chapters, which are chapters of consolation. There are pretty few in about I think it's 52 chapter book. There are a few chapters of consolation. But one of them is the Haftarah, the chapter from which the Haftarah for the second day of Rosh Hashanah is taken. And in that Haftarah, famously, so the children of Israel are in exile. And the Haftarah says that Rachel Mevaka al Bonera. Rachel was crying for her children. She refuses to give up on her children who are missing, who are inenu. That's what it says in the Haftarah. And God says to Rachel not to cry. God has heard you. God has heard you. God has heard you. and God is remembering. God remembers. But let's find that verse actually. It's in Yirmiyahu. What chapter is that? 31 or 32? Let me see if I can find it quickly. The Haftarah for the second day of Rosh Hashanah. Let's find that chapter.
31.
Chapter 31 sounds right. Let's see. Is it chapter 31? I'm trying to find this now.
Yes, it is chapter 30.
Yes, so chapter 31, right. Kol Mar Hashem, Kol Brahma Nishma, Nihi B'chi Tamurim, verse number 14 of chapter 31 of Yirmiyahu. Rachel Mevaka Al Boneh, Me'ana Lehinachem Al Boneh Ki Einenu. She refuses to give up, to stop crying for her children, Ki Einenu, who are missing. Rachel refuses to give up. She's the one matriarch who singled out. Rachel Mevaka Al Boneh. Kol Amar Hashem, and now God responds, says Yirmiyahu. Mini kolech mi bechi ve'enayich mi dimah. Ki yesh sachar lefulatechnu Hashem, v'shavu me'eretz oyev. V'yesh tikva lachritechnu Hashem, v'shavu banim l'gvulam. So God says to Rachel, stop crying. Stop crying. There is a reward for your actions. Your children will return from the lands of the enemies. There's hope for the future. V'shavu banim l'gvulam. And then the Haftarah ends with the following: Shamor Shamati Ephraim mitnoded. God says, I hear Ephraim. Say we translate bemoaning himself. Ephraim is bemoaning himself. Hashiveni v'yashuv, but bring me back and I shall return, for you are my God. Because acharei shuvi nichamti, v'acharei hivodi safakti al yarech boshti v'yam nichlamti. Right, difficult verse. Ephraim, who's Rachel's grandson, Rachel's son, as it were, because Jacob adopts them as Ephraim and Menashe. So Ephraim's not sure about return. Can I return? Can I not return? Ephraim's concerned. And the last verse of the Haftarah, Habein Yakili Ephraim. God says, isn't Ephraim a dear child to me? Im Yeled Shashuim, a newborn that I play with. Kimidei dabribo, even as I speak either about him or against him. Sometimes midei dabribo means to speak against. Even if I condemn, even when I speak against him, zachares karenuon, I always remember him. Alkein hamu me'aylo, and my inward parts are moved for him. Rachem arachamenu num Hashem, I will certainly have mercy upon him. Now this verse, which for many people, I think, is the highlight verse of Rosh Hashanah. It's very powerful. And if you remember the service of Rosh Hashanah, in the middle section we call Zichronot, so we have different verses. We have verses from the Torah, we have verses from the writings, and verses from the prophets. And there's 3 verses from the prophets, verses of consolation. The first verse is Zacharti lach chesed mi'urayich. God, the verse from Yirmiyahu, I remember the kindnesses of your youth. Chesed mi'urayich. That's the first verse. I remember that you followed me into the desert, says God. Haven't forgotten that when you were a youngster, a nar, a young person. And the next verse is, another verse. I remember the covenant I made in the time of Nurayach in your youth, and I will establish a covenant with you. And then the third verse, and the last verse of Zichronot before the petition, Haben Yakiru Ephraim, Im Yeled Shashuim. And that's different actually, because there, God is not just remembering the way we were in our youth. Maybe we were teenagers, maybe we were 10, 12, or 15, or 17. But God is remembering something else. The Yeled Shashuim, the newborn, the little plaything. Rachem Arachamenu. And the point is, it speaks to a relationship that's very, very deep. And it's part of the way we see the covenant. The covenant's a long-term relationship. It has its ups and downs. But fundamentally, we ask God to see us as little innocent children before we grew up and developed all kinds of other habits Not even the way we were as teenagers or as Nar, but the way we were Yeled Shashuim. Yeled from Yolu, the newborn, as it were, a baby. Remember us. And this is the last verse of the Zichronot section before the petition. And this is how we intend to overcome the judgment, because God is judging us. But we ask God to judge us not as a neutral person who would judge us. We ask God to see us in terms of a relationship, which is very complex. At the core of it is covenantal. The blessing is Zocher Abrit. We see ourselves as the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We see ourselves as the children of our mother Rachel, who has not given up on us. It's interesting, and I just conclude with the following drush. I said this many years ago. It's interesting that Yirmiyahu singles out Rachel. Rachel mevaka al baneha. Why is it Rachel? Why is Rachel the one who is crying for her children, who refuses to give up? It's what the Torah says about Jacob, Joseph. Jacob refused to accept the consolation. Joseph is Einenu. He's Einenu. Hayelad Einenu. But Jacob refused it. So in Yirmiyahu, it's Rachel, who's the Jacob figure. Why Rachel? Why is it Rachel and only Rachel? What happened to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Leah, all the others? And I think an answer, possibly, maybe it's a drush. Maybe it's not the pshat. But if it's a drush, it's a pretty good drush. I like it very much. And I'll tell you why it's Rachel. The children are in exile. The children are missing. The children are not home. God, I'll bring them home someday, but they're not home. Who can understand what it means to be in exile? Who can understand what it means not to have a place in this world? The people who really understand it best are the people that have no place. We have 7 patriarchs and matriarchs. We have 3 avot and 4 imahot. 6 of them have a place. 6 are buried in Marat HaMachpelah. 6 they find in Hebron. We have the address. Where is Rachel? Meitu Rachel Baderech. Somewhere on Derech, the path to Ephrat. In the book of Samuel, it's Tzelzach. In the Haftarah, it's called Brahma Nishma. Someplace. Where is she? Nobody knows. So Rachel is a person, she dies on Rachel's the woman who has no place. Only the one who has no place can really understand what it means not to have a place. What does it mean to come to a country and have no place? What does it mean to leave your home due to terrible circumstance and try to find a new place? To live among strangers, to be seen as an adversary. What does that mean? Who can understand such a thing? The one who has no place understands it very well. And that's our matriarch Rachel. It's certainly the case that when you read the Chumash, I wouldn't say she's the most ethical of the Avot and Imahot that we have. I think the ethics sometimes border on the dubious. Even our rabbinic tradition understood it. Doesn't matter. We still love her the most. She's our favorite for a very simple reason, because she loves us the most. And that's the way it works. So Rachel Mavaka Al-Banela, she never gives up on us. Even when everybody else does, our mother Rachel never gives up. So we ask God on Rosh Hashanah, don't give up on us. Don't give up on us. Try to see us in a favorable light, even as you judge us. Remember that we're part of a covenant, and we see ourselves as the children of the patriarchs and the matriarchs. So that perhaps is the reason for the choice of the Haftarah, the second day Rosh Hashanah. And you see it's reflected even in the service itself. That the Zichronot end, the 9th verse of Zichronot is Haben Yakili Ephraim. I guess I'll stop at this point. If anybody has a comment, again, I would advise everybody we have many good classes still, few still left, and in Elul, and we have the podcast, which you can get in Drisha Facebook or YouTube, Spotify. I think you'll find it very interesting. Are there any comments or questions now?
We have a question from Sarah.
Yes.
Sarah?
If I may, again, thank you so much, Rabbi Silber. Can you comment on the idea that if Hannah is saying, give me the chance and I will help change the world for the better, do you think there's any relationship between that and the fact that she has to so to speak, stand up to her husband and promote what she really wants. And then she has to stand up again to Ellie and say, no, I'm not drunk, but this is what I really want. Is there an implication that you really have to work hard if if you want to change the world? And I have one other quick question after
That is certainly I would say certainly the case that as far as that tradition is concerned, of course, Hannah is surrounded by very good people. Her husband is a loving husband. He means well. Sometimes those are the most difficult people to live with. Means well, but he doesn't really understand her. He doesn't understand what she wants. She just doesn't want it. She sees what no one else can see. And that's another important point about prayer. Why is it that Hannah can see what you read the story? Obviously, Sheila was utterly corrupt. Hophni and Pinchas are terrible people. They're ripping off God, they're ripping off the people, they're abusing the women, they're awful. And God hates them and God destroys them. But Elkanah goes periodically to Shiloh to bring his sacrifices, seems to be very involved in it, big supporter of the temple. But the point is that that's the theme of the book of Shmuel. One of the core ideas of the book of Shmuel, it's what I write about in my book written in Hebrew, Machut Adam, that what allows the people on the margins of the people who see. And no one is more on the margin than this childless woman. She's utterly on the margins, and even the people around her have no understanding of her. Not her husband, and not Ewi, who's a very sweet man, but he has no clue what she's about. And then you're utterly and totally alone, and then she turns to God. Rabbi Soloveitchik, when he talked about the story, what he emphasized actually, and I think it is in the story, I don't think it's at the center of it. So that's what is at the center is what, in my view, is what I said today. But he talked about a different aspect of prayer, which is dependency. The idea of prayer is you turn to God when you come to realize that only God can help you. That no one's going to, how hard it is to understand the other person. We don't understand ourselves or the other person. So the fact is, she turns to God after her husband says, listen, forget about the children business. I'm as good as 10 children. That's what she turns to God and she says, in effect, only you really understand what I want. No one else gets it, But I think the idea of being able to see the world as it is, to see all its failings, has to do with being disconnected from the world in a certain sense. Because if you're invested in the world, we're never going to see it as it is, because we don't want to see it as it is. We have too much at stake. Only someone who has nothing at stake, such as Hannah, can actually see the truth. And then the question becomes in prayer, how can one separate oneself? Is it possible, actually, to separate oneself from all those connections that we have in this world, which move us towards wanting to keep things the way they are? I don't want to change it, because if I change it, I might lose this, I might lose that. My boss will like it, my parents will like it, my grandparents will like it, my community won't like it, 100 reasons. How does one separate oneself from all of those factors that prevent us from seeing the truth so that we can actually speak the truth? I think that's one of the great challenges of prayer. In the case of Hannah, it's not that difficult, but the book of Shmuel is about kingship, and there's someone who is completely vested in the society, because the king is the strongest person in society. So the king doesn't want to change anything. The king's very happy with the way it is. And that's the challenge to the king, because the king's got to come to understand that the king just works for God and works for the people. That's what the book of Shmuel is about. So yes, I think that Hannah, her situation allows her to see the truth, which is obvious when you read it. And then she's able to say, we got to change, this is not good. Let me see if I can be helpful in making a change. And yes, that requires a certain sense of self. There's no doubt that's what I said before about humility and strength. That prayer means I believe I can make a difference in the world, in my world, in the whole world, in my life, in my family, in people around me. I believe I can do something. At the same time, humility is the core attribute. I understand my limitations, and I may fail also. That's also important. But it doesn't mean I'm not going to try.
Rabbi Silber, the same with Rachel, her inability to extricate herself from her home, the fact that she had to do that, there was tragedy in that, and it kept going backwards, but she was human, almost more human than Rivka and Sarah.
Right, the point that Rachel in the Chumash is certainly that way. She's torn between her father. She does take the idols of her father with her, and she dies on the path. And then the question is, how does one understand her dying on the path? Jacob chooses to understand it, and maybe I'll finish with this thought about Yaakov and Rachel. In Haftarah, Rachel is presented as a Jacob figure. Yaakov loves Rachel. She dies on the path going back. She dies after taking the Trafim. So she dies, one might say, betwixt and between. And then the question is, how does one evaluate Rachel? Jacob chooses to evaluate her in the following sense. She was on the way back when she died. And the prophet Yirmiyahu just takes it one step further. She is the matriarch who is so beloved, because she's the one who actually will never give up on her children. So there is a process within the Chumash itself, I think, of seeing Rachel in a positive sense. It's what Yaakov says at the end of Sefer Bereshit. And of course, Yirmiyahu, in his prophecy, takes it even beyond that and presents Rachel as the most beloved of all our forebears. Okay, I guess I'll stop at this point. If anybody has more questions, you can email me. It's dsilber@risha.org. I wish everybody a Ketiva v'chatima tova, good year to all of us. We have other classes as well. But again, a good year, and we come back again to learn together. Thank you.
Shana
Thank you so
Tova.
much.
Thank
To you, Rabbi.
Thank you so much,
Thank
everyone,
you.
for joining us.
Toda Rabba, Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
I do want to just say we'd have one more Elul class, which is tomorrow with Rabbi Tzvi Novik, which is on, Sarah. Another text that we read on Rosh Hashanah, the visitation of Sarah. And of course, more things in Tishrei, which you can see at elul.drisha.org, as well as, I think Rabbi Silber mentioned, the music and liturgy podcasts, which are really exciting, and I urge you to check them out. And yeah, so thank you so much for learning with us, and Shana Tova.